All right, we're back here for more. And we're going to get to some actual, not that the first two modules haven't been great, but we're going to get to some meat of this course. We're going to get into introducing the Cert Study Lab. So we're going to talk about what we're here to actually teach today in the building of a Cert Study Lab for Microsoft certification.
That's right. Let's have a look at our objectives. What we're going to do here is introduce the lab so you understand how it works. We're going to survey other options, but again, we're going to give detail on them later in the course. There's something called AutoLab that you should be familiar with. This is a framework to automate the creation and reuse of a lab. And Microsoft Virtual Labs, which provides you a free way to get hands-on experience with technology without having to build a lab yourself. At the tail end of the course, as we've already mentioned, we'll look at Azure, yet another option. What is our solution? What is this lab we've been hinting at and flirting with for the last couple modules? This ultimately is what we're building today in this course. This topology I built in Microsoft Visio. It should look familiar because I showed you something relatively similar in the previous module. The hypervisor we're going to use is Client Hyper-V, and the reason for that is if your hardware host system, your tablet, your laptop, your desktop computer, has Windows 8.1 or Windows 10 Professional or Enterprise, that is, then you already have Hyper-V built into the system. You can use another hypervisor if you want to. There's VirtualBox, there's VMware. If you're a Linux person, there's KVM. Recall that a hypervisor refers to the software layer on your system that allows it to run one or more virtual computer instances, virtual machines or VMs. Azure, when you're working in infrastructure as a service, means that you're deploying virtual machines up in the cloud directly and connecting to them, I should say, from your system. The operating system software in use here is going to depend upon what you're studying. If you're studying Microsoft Exchange Server, for instance, then you'll need that. SharePoint Server will involve both SharePoint, Windows Server, SQL Server. There's quite a few requirements for a SharePoint farm. But the good news is that we can take advantage of the Microsoft Evaluation Center and download fully functional trial versions of that software. If you and/or your business belong to the Microsoft Developer Network or MSDN, there's the entire library of server and client software, development software available for your use there. And FOSS stands for free and open source. This means you may need to interoperate between Windows and Linux, let's say. Most Linux distributions subscribe to the FOSS model, which means that there's no server and/or client licensing required for those systems. For routers, because this is going to be a routed lab, we're going to use not RAS, which is a service you may be familiar with that's built into Windows Server. It stands for Routing and Remote Access Service. But we're going to use an open source project called VIOS. It's a virtual Linux-based software router that will more than be sufficient for our practice lab needs. And then I've annotated the diagram as you see here. So we're going to have this VIOS software router connected to two separate Hyper-V virtual switches. Each one of those virtual switches is going to be on its own IPv4 subnetwork. On one side, we're going to have a Windows Server domain controller called DC1. On the other subnet, I have in my environment on this computer a Windows Server 2016 member server, as well as a Windows 10 Enterprise client machine. And just that topology, you can always add to it, but that topology is going to give you a huge amount of flexibility for developer, IT pro, or potentially cloud scenarios as well. What other options are available? AutoLab, we're going to spend time with this, I believe, in Module 7, is an open source project written by a Pluralsight colleague of mine, Jason Helmick, among others. It's a community project. But the long and the short of it is that this is a series of PowerShell modules and commands that enable you to automate building a lab, including downloading the ISO images and everything, and then resetting it, taking snapshots periodically through the lab lifecycle and resetting it. It can be an awfully handy thing to use.
It sounds like it.
It really is. And if nothing else, it's going to give you a great excuse to learn PowerShell. You can't avoid PowerShell, and I hope you wouldn't want to.
Well, and it turns out you mentioned Jason Helmick. I think I'm just here for marketing for this course. It's really all I'm doing so far. Jason Helmick, who you mentioned, is working on this with you collaboratively. He's a PowerShell guru, and he's got some courses on MBA for PowerShell. We're about to launch a big series of content for PowerShell.
Very cool.
So we've got a bunch more coming up. So yeah, PowerShell. And this, I say that to really market the product more than anything else. PowerShell is amazing. PowerShell will help you with anything, almost anything in the entire Microsoft ecosystem. Server management, server implementation, installs, configuration, all of it. It's all there. So yeah, if you've got something like this, it's going to save you time and effort galore.
Right, exactly. The other thing is the Microsoft Virtual Lab, which allows you to work with Microsoft server and client, development technologies, database, the whole stack, for fun and for free without the overhead of building and hosting it. You may not have a hardware host that has enough RAM to do justice to even a small lab. So this is an option for you. And the link, the short link I have on this slide will take you there. We'll do a demo in just a moment where I show you this. But this is going to give you 2-hour blocks of time that are centered around a particular technology. For instance, there might be a lab on Active Directory user and group management, let's say, or doing backups in SQL Server. And you're interacting with one or more cloud-based virtual machines. These aren't simulations where if you go off the beaten path and start clicking around, it's going to dead end you. No, these are virtual machines, so you can experiment really to your heart's content. And when you exit the lab, the situation or the lab resets itself to a pristine state. They're free. You can't beat the price. You need a Microsoft account if you want to track your progress with virtual labs. There's no mess or setup headaches, of course. It's just click and run. Whoops. I advanced that slide and didn't mean to, so I'll repeat with the last sentence. There's no mess or setup headache, so it's really just a click and run environment. And what's beautiful about this is that if you work through a 2-hour time block and want to try something different, you're not limited to just one run through. You can restart the lab as many times as you want. So these are a great way, not only for business people to evaluate Microsoft technologies who may be interested in adopting them in their business, but for us as IT certification candidates, we can use virtual labs for our learning benefit as well. So great service.
It's a slightly better, cheaper, less intensive version of what I was talking about, having the network at your house where you're actually building Exchange, building SharePoint, building Windows. Gets a little cumbersome potentially. So some virtual labs that are relatively lightweight are much simpler.
For sure. If you've ever investigated SharePoint Server, a wonderful product, of course, but it's going to require pretty wide spectrum knowledge because you'll need to deploy Active Directory, SQL Server, IIS, and that's not even getting to the SharePoint bits.
Yeah, that one's an adventure.
And then, as we've mentioned, Microsoft Azure, the public cloud. One of the many things that Azure gives us is the ability to run virtual machines in the cloud. It's an enormous service list. Besides the virtual machines, Azure also has something called Platform as a Service, which is, I look at it as essentially as hosted web applications, mobile apps, database-backed web applications, application programming interface or API services. All of that falls under the PaaS umbrella. IaaS, which is the screenshot you see on this slide right now, shows the Azure Marketplace where you can deploy virtual machines using images that are pre-installed with not only Microsoft software like Windows Server, but also endorsed Linux distributions like Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Ubuntu Server, CentOS, and there's even third-party partners in here, Barracuda, Veeam. So you can kick the tires, so to speak, with a number of different technologies here. If you're wondering how you would pay for an Azure subscription, you can actually do a 30-day trial, a free trial that gives you $200 in service credit. At the end of the 30 days, you're not going to get charged. You'd have to manually convert your subscription to pay as you go before you start accruing charge. So that's a nice entry point. Again, to bring up MSDN, the MSDN subscriptions give you, depending upon your service level, if you have the Visual Studio MSDN, that's $150 a month of recurring credit. The billing for this is you have to have a Microsoft account and a credit card to sign up. And like I said, the $200 1-month trial doesn't automatically convert to a pay-as-you-go. So I think that should help you rest easier, because I know from experience a common fear point, or if not, fear may be a little strong, but a concern point of many, very reasonably, is, well, I'm a little nervous because I don't know what I'm doing with Azure, and I'm afraid that at the end of the month I'm going to have a huge bill. Don't worry about that, because that's not how the trial works.
Well, and even if you've switched to a paid subscription, we have the ability to set spending limits.
Right.
And when you hit those limits, all your services will turn off. It's a trade-off. When you hit a spending limit, things are going to turn off, but you're not going to get charged $1,000 extra in a month. I happen to have turned that off once. Turned off the extra spending block because I was hosting some services. Yeah. And spun up some VMs to do a test and forgot to unspin up those VMs and did end up with about a $600 Azure bill that I had to go in and pay. Yeah. So you have the option not to have that happen. But if you do turn that off, make sure you're paying attention to what you provisioned and turned off.
And if you're going to stick around with us to Module 8, we certainly hope you do, I'll make sure to show you that.
Yep.
Spending limits, billing alarms, those fail-safes. Yes, we have to remember that the public cloud is a shared responsibility model. That's the term that's normally used, where Microsoft provides the tools and gives you the security of the cloud, but it's up to you as the tenant, customer, client, whatever term you want to use the tools responsibly. Alrighty. For our demo, I'd like to show you a little bit of the virtual lab aspect. So we'll switch on over to our Edge browser, and we're at the TechNet Evaluation Center. It used to be that the virtual labs were spread across at least a couple Microsoft sites, mainly TechNet for the IT Pro content and the MSDN sites for the development content. But nowadays, we're seeing a consolidation, and I'm so happy that Microsoft is doing this. They're collapsing their technical documentation under one umbrella, docs.microsoft.com, and the virtual labs are now under the TechNet Evaluation Center, which we're going to be spending time in later, because this is where we download the evaluation software. Let's see, how do we want to approach this? Let's scroll down, and there's a button here called View All Virtual Labs. Now, I must say, that the web being dynamic and with 21st century IT and DevOps and continuous integration, the specific clicky I'm doing here, keep in mind that the interface may be different by the time you do it. It's part of the ever-evolving web. But I'm confident that if you understand the basic workflow, you're just fine. It looks like we have a choice to pare down on what kind of virtual labs we want to see. I'll select Windows Server. We see virtual labs is already pre-selected under resource types, because again, virtual labs is under a larger umbrella. And let's filter the results. Gives us a number of different virtual labs. Again, as I said, they're 2-hour time blocks. Getting to know, these are Windows Server 2012. Not sure if there's 2016 as of this recording, but it really doesn't matter. Let me just grab one at random here, this Hyper-V one. That's appropriate given that our virtual lab that we're building uses Hyper-V. I'm already logged in with my Microsoft account, so I can not only run the virtual lab, but track my progress. You'll want to take a look at the system requirements to make sure that you're using a compatible browser. What you're seeing on your screen right now is my Windows 10 Enterprise Edition box, and I'm using the native Edge browser, so I'm fine with system requirements. So that just means that we can click Launch Lab, and that will spin up one or more virtual machines for us to interact with. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but in addition to the virtual machines, it's also a guided lab experience. I mean, let's face it. If you're sitting down to master a Microsoft technology and you're given a number of virtual machines and nothing else, you might be left thinking, okay, what next? So a nice benefit of these virtual labs is that you'll actually be given a step-by-step scenario-based lab to work through. And you can actually download those labs and use them with your own lab environment. Isn't that awesome? So let's see here, just to get a basic familiarity with the interface. At left, like I said, this is a live connection to a virtual machine. It looks like this particular lab, we start off on a Windows 8.1 professional machine. I've never run this lab, so I'm learning it right along with you. But the interface shows us our timer countdown. We can exit the lab at any time. It shows our connection strength. It allows us to switch from machine to machine using this drop-down. It looks like we have an administrative workstation, a domain controller, and it looks like 3 member servers. And just going from desktop to desktop here. That's the Machines tab. Notice that you can interact with a mounted ISO DVD. You may be able to change credentials, issue a Control-Alt-Delete. The Content tab is where we can get to the manual, as you see here. So let me click Manual, and this may very well open as a Adobe Acrobat PDF file. Or no, actually it opens up using the XPS format, and it asks us what we want to do with it. Save, save as, or cancel. And then let's open it. It'll open on my Windows 10 machine in the Reader application. It's a fully formatted XPS file. And I know the text is probably too small for you to make it out. It really doesn't matter. I just want to demonstrate here that this is a really nicely produced, formatted, step-by-step lab broken down into exercises. So you could print this or just keep a copy on your computer for reference. Really nice learning options here, no question about it. Let me click Exit here to end the lab. There's no penalty in ending a lab earlier than the 2 hours. After the 2 hours, it'll just automatically end. We're asked here to do an optional evaluation. I'll skip it in this case, and then we're done. Just as simple as can be. While I have the tab up, we might as well also just show you the Auto Lab environment. Again, we're going to spend, I believe, the better part of a module on this project. But this is an open source project that makes it easier to stand up a virtual lab. It relies upon Windows PowerShell and also client-side Hyper-V. You need an internet connection. It's nicely documented. If you see here, I've scrolled down to the README, and there's a nice step-by-step on how to use it. But again, I don't want to foreshadow too much. If you're not familiar with GitHub.com, I suggest that you do get familiar, because so much Microsoft technology now, regardless of your role, whether you're a systems administrator, a developer, an architect, a database administrator, whatever it is that you're doing or want to do, it's hard to avoid source code control. Think of PowerShell, for instance. You might think, I'm a sysadmin, I write PowerShell scripts for administrative automation. But what about when you need to share your work with other administrators? It's nice and convenient to host that file, those files, in a central location where they're version tracked and nobody's stepping on each other's work. So GitHub, it's a free service, but I would suggest that you create a free account so that you can more decently interact with the content there. For instance, you can contribute to this Auto Lab project if you want to, if you're so inclined. The other thing you might want to do besides create a GitHub account is to download the Git version control client to your system. This is a cross-platform tool set. The Windows installer is really cool because it can integrate with your command shell or your PowerShell commands. And again, just makes it easy to work with Git version control. Let's return to our regularly scheduled programming, in other words, our slide deck. And that's really it. We've come to the end of this module and we're ready to look at our lessons learned. First lesson learned. We didn't say this explicitly, so let's say it right now. Your production environment is not the place to experiment.
Don't take my examples.
Well, that's what I was actually going to say. Earlier, you remember, I believe in the previous module, Christopher and I were talking about technology over time, the trend toward convergence on one hand, things, the form factors getting smaller, but technology moving faster. I remember back in the old days when I used to walk to and from work uphill both ways through the snowstorm, barefoot, without a coat, this
Yep.
sort of thing.
Yep.
I did do a little of this, of testing
Well, I still do this.
in a production
that,
environment.
That home environment I talked about. So one of the ways I learned, and when you were talking about the labs, I was thinking about this. I like labs. I like that they're curated and they're kind of patterned, but I don't like them for the same reason. Because in a lab, they're built for nothing to go wrong.
Right.
Learn this, but with no adversity in that process. I've liked running things at home for so long because there's a necessity for it to work even when it doesn't. I've upgraded, I'll install a new Exchange server and start migrating mailboxes, and something will just go horribly sideways and all of my Exchange is down for half a day. Some of those are critical. Like I said, I was hosting at one point, so I had people not able to get into their email, and I have to figure out what's gone on, what's happened, what's wrong with either the migration or the new install or the interactivity of the two or some configuration somewhere. Now this is my environment. It's not a company production environment that there are millions of dollars on the line per minute in transactions that I'm risking messing with.
Yeah.
It's a couple of local people and small organizations that I'm helping for free host. So they have a certain expectation that there may be some instability in what's happening. There may be a half a day of outage in a couple of months. So it's okay to do that. So I tend to do it just because I like that. The necessity to use it in production means I have to learn how not to break it,
Right.
so to speak. But yeah, not a great plan for like at your work, at your company. I'm not going to come here to Microsoft and run into a server room somewhere and start making changes to servers because I want to learn something new. So.
And also to that point of back in the day, building a practice lab then, I remember, involved procuring or finding unused physical boxes, physical monitors.
Stacks. I had a dining room, stacks and stacks. I had a roommate, we probably had 15 or 20 computers in that dining room at one point. Old desktops, just stacked up, and then we would remote into them. We still were using remote technologies at the time, but we would just have physical DC over here, and we'd try and kind of label them, but it never really worked because they changed so frequently. I've been there, done that.
Nowadays, with virtualization and the cloud, it's feasible to get into the industry never having cracked open a server or a desktop computer chassis. So I just want to give a shout out to basic computer hardware and the skills involved in there. Again, it's easy when we're abstracting networking and abstracting memory and CPU with virtual machines and Azure. It can be difficult sometimes to conceptualize the actual hardware itself.
I never really thought about how I feel about that. That a lot of admins these days aren't necessarily building a box under a desk somewhere or even in a rack somewhere. I'll think about that one of these days.
So I think we can summarize by safely saying Microsoft makes it affordable to gain true hands-on experience. And our goal in the training is to keep your costs as close to zero as possible. If you have a compatible Windows 8.1 or Windows 10 machine, you've got the client Hyper-V. The virtual labs, there's no investment outside of an internet connection there. The evaluation software that we'll be getting into, again, that's free. So far, that seems pretty cost-effective. In our next module, we're going to begin assembling the building blocks. In other words, how do you install the Hyper-V feature on your Windows client machine? And once you've installed it, how do you create a virtual machine? What's a virtual switch? How should I lay out the virtual switches to match the lab topology? Stick around. We look forward to seeing you then.